How you guys doing today? It's Tuesday here in Minnesota in the upper Midwest. I got some Terry Pollard playing, one of the great female piano players and vibraphonist of this time. I remember she's from Detroit. This is a cool Bethlehem gold black cover. Pretty tough record to find. Don Fonsequest is on this. Howard Roberts is on the guitar. Herman Wright's on the bass. Frank DeVito on the drums. Fantastic player. There were some great gals in jazz who have honestly slipped through the cracks. Probably more so than the fellas, sadly. But first of all, I want to add something to the contemporary stuff we've been talking about. The records I showed you in the last episode kind of were from the same era as the 6 that were issued. So I kept the scope to that late 50s contemporary stuff that they were already putting out. So I just kind of searched that other 75 records for titles. But after that series, the contemporary sequence continues on. And there's some great stuff coming into the early 60s that we're going to discuss just real quickly and briefly here. First and foremost, I meant to include these the other day, is the Blackhawk series. And if you ask me, this should be issued as a box set. One of the great live West Coast cool bop meets just the cool. It's just fantastic. The group is outstanding. The great Joe Gordon on the trumpet's just a revelation at points. Richie Kamuka's fantastic. Shelly Mann's fantastic. It's really a treat, you know. And Victor Feldman's on the piano, of course of British descent, and Monty Budwig's on the bass. It's a great quintet. And they're doing a lot of standards. The version of Summertime that's on album 3 or 4 is one of the great versions of that song that I've ever heard. But the entire record is filled with beautiful, dreamy ballads, really bright, up-tempo, fiery stuff. Gordon is quite acrobatic and a beautiful, clean tone. He's not quite the brightness of a Hubbard or a Clifford Brown or a Booker Little, but Gordon does have a nice up-tempo tone that cuts through nice and clean. He's also beautiful on ballads. He's great with the mute. Gordon's one of the real highlights on these records. And of course, Richie Kamuka, this is a showcase for him as well. He's kind of a little bit between the cracks on the West Coast scene. He was a member of the Four Brothers, Woody Herman's sax section. He's on a lot of great records as a sideman. Some of the stuff as a leader is a little bit convoluted. He has a few LPs that are on the Hi-Fi label, but because they're not really billed to him specifically, they just have kind of been attributed to him over time. You don't really look at him when you see him on the records and go, oh, that's a Richie Kamuka record. You got to kind of do a little digging on those. But again, this Blackhawk series is worthy of a box set. It should be packaged together, and it needs to be under $80. They need to stop it with this clown. And I know the market demands are crazy, and global commerce and trade is all in a bad place right now. So I'm not naive to that. But you're not going to convince me that you need to charge $200 for 4 pieces of vinyl. And it's highway robbery. It's a bit of a joke. Like I said on the last episode, when Outcast Aquemini came out in 1998, 99, they put on 3 records. It was $9.99 for 3 records. It wasn't a gatefold. They just put them all in a little single jacket, nice thick spine. Aquemini is one of the great hip-hop records of all time. If you don't know Outcast Aquemini, that's organic music with good harmony and melodic vocals and melodic beats. So they're not just kind of completely repetitious, boring samples. There's a lot of real organic production that happens. Again, melody is important. Most of these songs are very hum-alongable. You can sing to them. They'll be stuck in your head sometimes for a couple days. There's some pop sensibility to Outcast Aquemini that doesn't quite get there on the first 2 records they do. And after that one, they start taking more control themselves, and they truly don't have the skill set that the Dungeon family, who does the production on Aquemini, has. And so you start listening to Hey Ya and Roses and some of that stuff that comes out later. It's a little bit more immature beat-wise, sound-wise. Some of it's good, some of it's great, some of it I just didn't like. Whereas Aquemini, I like the entire record from front to back. But the point of that record is it was $10, $9.99 for 3 records. And that was 1998, 22 years ago. You're telling me you can't put 3-4 records of a jazz artist out for $80? I don't believe it. I don't believe it. That's 7 times what the Aquemini record cost, 22 years ago. And I know the market conditions are different, but they're just preying on middle-aged, bougie jazz fans knowing that they got money, It's record store day is kind of preying on those same people. And it kind of turns me off, honestly. I think it's kind of gross. Again, post 3580, which is where that Blackhawk, those 4 come out sequentially. 3577 to 3580 is the Blackhawk set. After that, and I meant to include those in my last episode, I had them pulled out, and I went before it, and I forgot to pull them all the way out. But I did want to mention them because I think they're totally worthy of being out there as individual pieces, but also as a set. And there's also been some more material added to it on CD over the last 10 years to actually make it a 5 CD set. So I'm not even sure if that's on LP anywhere. So make it a nice 5 record set, no more than $100, or else you're just being jerks about it. Teddy Edwards, who I've talked about some recently, the fantastic LA scene, beautiful player. I told you guys I just really recently found 3592, a nice original pressing. The jacket's seen its better days, but I talked about him on this when I found out in Chicago. He makes a series of great records at Contemporary. All are worthy of reissue. I think this is a Japanese pressing, if I'm not mistaken. But again, I think Edwards stuff has had some reissue daylight. And there's another great Teddy Edwards together again. Phineas Newborn, the great Ray Brown, who's working with Contemporary Some at this point. Ed Thigpen on the bass, who also worked with Ray Brown, with Oscar Peterson. Howard McGee, one of the great originators of bebop. He's part of that scene back at Minton's on the East Coast. He knows the swing era. He knows the bebop era. He knows this modern era. He's a great player. His work on Bethlehem's outstanding from the mid-50s. McGee makes some stuff at Savoy before that. He's just a really beautiful, kind of middle-of-the-road trumpet player, a precursor in some ways to guys like Donald Byrd, Art Farmer, Kenny Dorham. A real sympathetic ear. He seems to just really grasp a tune, the setting, and make sounds and tones that just seem to apply so wonderfully. And again, he's playing with the great Teddy Edwards there. That's a great duel. For real, Hampton Hawes. Hampton Hawes didn't have an actually released in that series 4. But here he's playing with Harold Land, Scott LaFaro, and Frank Butler. This is 3589, which puts it fairly late in the sequence. And that's a pretty great modern session when you have Hampton Hawes with guys like Scott LaFaro and Harold Land, and of course Frank Butler, one of the great drummers that kind of goes under the radar somewhat today. Another great Howard McGee record here with Shelly Manne, Phineas Newborn, and Leroy Vinegar. Maggie's Back in Town. And so when you get into artists like this, you just got to find their work, no matter where it shows up from that certain eras that you love. And so McGee is one of the guys that got me into contemporary, especially this later contemporary stuff, along with Teddy Edwards. Here's the aforementioned Joe Gordon. He's a part of that Blackhawk series. He has some early work at Emerson in 54, 55. The 10-inch is really worth seeking out if you can find it. It's not too expensive. But here he is at Contemporary. This is an OJC reissue of it. 35.97, looking good. He's playing here with Jimmy Woods, who played bass with Ellington for quite a while. Dick Whittington, Jimmy Bond, and Milt Turner. So kind of a bit of an obscure, at least to me, rhythm section. Dick Whittington, Jimmy Bond, I've heard that name, and Milt Turner. I don't know Dick Whittington or Milt Turner at all, if I'm honest. That's part of the West Coast scene. There's just more players you don't really know. Another Teddy Edwards, here's with Heart and Soul. The great piano player Gerald Wiggins is on this, who makes a great series of records on the West Coast for a lot of the small West Coast labels. If you see Jerry Wiggins records, they're really outstanding. He's a great player with Leroy Vinegar, and then the aforementioned Milt Turner shows up again. So there's quite a bit of Teddy Edwards here. They're documenting one of the great voices of this time. And this is Prince Lasha Quintet with Sonny Simmons. This starts to push out into the avant-garde, probably 61, maybe 62. Gary Peacock's on this, Mark Proctor, Gene Stone, Sonny Simmons, and Prince Lasha. Again, this is going to be more influenced by the Coltrane, Ornette Coleman school of things. But Coltrane's having just enough success with it. A label like Contemporary is going to take that chance. Of course, honorable mention here is the Blackstone Legacy record by Woody Shaw. It's a record I've not been able to track down. I've had it on my want list for a long time. It's going to eventually get reissued by somebody, and I'll just grab it then. The originals are going for big money. You just can't even outbid on them. They're going for hundreds of dollars. It's probably pretty rare in its initial pressing, although it has seen numerous pressings. If you go on Discogs and you want to watch it become available, there's at least 4 or 5, maybe 6 different versions of it that has been pressed over the years. So it's certainly out there. 2 other titles I want to mention real quickly. Elmo Hope Trio, fantastic Elmo Hope, and then Harold Land, the Fox. And this has the great Dupree Bolton on it. One of the Oklahoma native trumpet player that's a fiery revelation. He shows up on that Pacific record by, oh my God, mind blank, hold on. Katanga. That Katanga record that came out on Tone Poet last year. Dupree Bolton's on that with Elmo Hope and Herbie Lewis and Frank Butler. And this one has Jimmy Bond and Frank Butler. So I guess I did know the name Jimmy Bond because I've seen that name numerous times. But interesting thing about these 2 records, 3620 and 3619, is that these were actually purchases by Contemporary and not original Contemporary recordings. They were, however, recorded on the West Coast, but they were recorded for the Hi-Fi label. And Hi-Fi is a great little label. I love their inner logo. It's fantastic. This is that Elmo Hope record, and you can see they just took the photograph and cropped it for this cover. But this is the original Hi-Fi release, and this was the Contemporary repackaging of it. Hi-Fi starts going the way of easy listening by 1960. They've already been doing all that Hawaii and Music for Volcano kind of series. The guy's name skips my memory right now. I have a lot of his records. They're fun. Similar to the guy who did The Village, whose name I can't think of either right now. But they're fun records, but they're not jazz records. And Hi-Fi sold that stuff well. So that's the direction they went. And so stuff like Harold Land and the Fox, Elmo Hope Trio, it just seemed like it needed a new home. And exactly how Contemporary bought them or why, I don't know exactly the details, but they make more sense on Contemporary. Hi-Fi had some other great titles, by the way, that it's a shame that we don't see. And then this is the original cover for the Fox, which was on, again, Hi-Fi. And this is just a reissue of it. But, again, the Hi-Fi versions of these records have become quite collectible and fairly rare. And so those are some other titles I wanted to add in to this Contemporary series because it's just a great label. It's a great label that really made some great music, purchased some good titles to add to its catalog. And it's something that was pretty omnipresent in the music industry with smaller labels being bought up by bigger labels. And it happens, of course, in rock and roll as well. It's pretty common for a big band to really work to be on some small, obscure label. And then as that band got bigger, that label would get bought out, giving that bigger label access to that band. And it happens with the bands from Nirvana to Motley Crue. It's a pretty common thing. Guns N' Roses, it's definitely a common thing for that to happen. One of the other things I want to talk about today, and we'll get back to my legacy series on my next episode, and I got some other kind of cool ideas I'm percolating right now, but there's an interesting thing that happens in music, and it happens across the board, where something becomes innovative and new, and it's done probably regionally. It has very local, regional success initially. It becomes refined and slowly starts to get a bigger audience. As it starts to become the new accepted sound, reluctantly the big labels will slowly start to move towards it. And eventually they'll bring it in. And there'll be this moment, brief moment, of this golden era of this genre where this new independent sound that's innovative and fresh and has a young audience that's cool and hip will hit the mainstream. And because it's at a new big label now, it's also getting the production values added to it and larger arrangements and the value and the backing to promote something and to record it properly. And if it calls for strings, to bring in a string section. So most of these movements that happen in music have an underground period, a kind of development gestation period, a moment where it ascends into the spotlight. And the individuality of that movement and the uniqueness of it meets the production and accessibility of the mainstream. And that window is very brief because the mainstream can only touch this independent new sound for so long before it becomes mainstream and watered down itself, allowing its originators and original followers to kind of reject it. And it now creates a demand for a new thing for the next generation to kind of find. And with things like music, these generations are very brief, a 4 or 5 year window. And you'll see it in hip hop, you'll see it in almost all forms of music where a label will come along and be very cutting edge and define this new thing that is different from what's happening in the mainstream. The mainstream is kind of lagging behind. But as that new thing kind of defines itself and proves itself with some sales and some commercial success, as the scene becomes big enough to have a national following, eventually the big labels will go, oh, and then they'll bring that into the fold. A great example is the Fugees, The Score. If you listen to that record, it's got that new East Coast sound that's happening with Nas and the Wu-Tang and Mobb Deep and all that stuff that's going on the East Coast. And they bring that sound into Columbia Studios, and the production value on The Score is just outstanding. Yet it doesn't lose its edge, it doesn't lose all of its impact. And it's very hard for that to maintain for too long, because it's hard to be hungry once you're making money. It's hard for the labels to not want to further water it down and make it more accessible to even a broader audience. It wants to ignore the cutting edge as much as it can to keep things as accessible and as financially viable at all junctures. And that same thing happens in jazz. And I've been thinking about doing a series on jazz labels to try to give some scope and understanding when each jazz label kind of ascends and has their moment. And it's a tough thing to kind of really quantify in some way, but yet it's clear that 54-55 is where Bethlehem's impact is the greatest. It's pretty clear where Savoy's impact is in the late 40s recordings that they're doing. It's pretty clear that Blue Note's moment is 56 to 59, where they're making that hard bop thing and everyone else is trying to catch up to them. It's pretty clear that the prestige soul jazz is one of the most commercially viable selling quadrants of the jazz market in the 60s, and all those black organ players and guitarists were making records that were commercially successful, and most of the jazz labels out there try to follow it, and the ones who didn't almost all disappeared. I did an episode on that last year. It was a very important thing to try to be commercially successful. So all these little labels had moments in the sun where they were kind of the cutting edge sound. For a minute, Contemporary in 54, 55, at the end of the 10-inch series, early in their 3500 sequence, they were making pretty cutting edge West Coast cool bop, hard attacking, a lot of style and personality and virtuosity. So it's like almost every label has these moments where they become that cutting edge, that sound that's defining what's happening. Everyone else is trying to catch up. And then the four major labels, Decca, Capitol, Columbia, and RCA, are never part of that conversation. And they really don't ever embody the cutting edge in jazz until Columbia in 1956 signs Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers. That was a big moment for Columbia. It was a risky moment because it was contemporary with what was happening in jazz for the first time. The big labels were putting that out there across the country. It doesn't exist before that. And it's interesting because when you look at this whole dynamic, labels like Capitol, Decca, Chorale, which was their subsidiary for jazz sometimes, RCA, you have a hard time picking out any records on those labels that were cutting edge jazz in the moment that it was happening. And if you were to do a year by year list of the labels that were most important in 55, none of the four major labels, not jazz labels, but four major labels are in that conversation. It's not until like 1960 where Columbia can honestly make a stake and say 59, 60, we are one of the most important jazz labels, even though they weren't a jazz label. They were an everything label. But in 59, 60, with the stuff that they were putting out, the Mingus and the Brubeck and the G.G. Grice, Donald Byrd, Miles Davis's works. And then in 60, they bring Monk into the fold. 59, 60, they bring Monk in. And Monk is that next piece of that puzzle of Columbia saying, we're going to allow fairly current sounding, innovative, fresh sounds in jazz to happen at our label. And again, find me a Capitol jazz record that's capturing what's current, what's edgy, what's the new sound in jazz as that sound's happening. I couldn't think of one. You know, you have a few kind of examples, Blue Surge maybe, but again, that's not a very risky record to record a Bostonian baritone sax player doing semi-cool. It's not easy listening, but it's not challenging music by any dimension. And so it's interesting just to kind of see this unfolding and how these major labels manage their risk and don't take super big chances. So I'm kind of challenging y'all out there to come up with labels, especially those big four labels, Capitol, Columbia, RCA, Decca. What are the most cutting edge, dangerous records those labels made that are concurrent with what's happening in jazz at the time it's happening? And again, I've been scanning my memory, trying to think. Decca, Chorale, they hardly touched black artists at all, and really were the fourth wheel in that quartet. RCA, they do have some Rollins stuff. 1960, 61, none of it's really cutting edge or risky. You know, the bridge is, for all as beautiful as it is, it's an easy, accessible record. You know, he didn't challenge RCA's norm with that. And I think RCA on some level knew that Rollins had made a choice. Rollins departed the scene and spent a year and a half on the bridge rehearsing and practicing, trying to determine who he was. And in some cases, following Coltrane and Ornette Coleman into the fire, if that's not you, why do it? And so I don't think in any way a guy like Rollins was not selling out or making easy, accessible records. He decided that this is who he was. And those records on RCA are great records, but they're just not challenging the current sounds in jazz at that time. And then you look at stuff like what Coltrane's doing on Impulse in 61, 62, 63. There's very few examples of that stuff getting on the mainstream labels at all. So it's just an interesting little tidbit, something that when you collect different genres and you see the development of different labels and sounds and how things kind of make it into the mainstream and have this golden moment where it never sounded better, it's packaged well, produced well, and then it literally has about a 6-month shelf life before there's this wave and flood of kind of imitators and copycats, all kind of without the grift of who the underground cats have and were. So they're all kind of just imitating, trying to make something commercially viable, and it just waters the whole scene down to the point of dissipation. And I've seen it happen multiple times. And it's interesting in jazz to see how Columbia did pick some risky stuff. And by 1960, you can easily put Columbia in the top 5, top 7 jazz labels, even though it's not a jazz label. They certainly have taken that step. But Capitol, RCA, and Decca don't really ever become that current with jazz. And again, part of what we're talking here is race, because most of the cutting edge stuff is coming out of the black community. That's the stuff that's going to be uncomfortable for white America to digest. And there's some really edgy white composition happening in jazz, but that's not posing the same risk to those white labels. Jimmy Joffrey on Capitol is a great example. If that was a black guy making that, I don't think Capitol would have dreamt of putting that out. But because it was a white cat who had some fame and legacy working with Herman and where he worked, I think it was accessible and acceptable, and they took that chance with Joffrey's early work. Jerry Mulligan, another great example. Even Birth of the Cool, which got Miles' name attached to it somewhat incorrectly, Capitol didn't really push that record very hard. It wasn't until the success that Miles was having on Columbia that Capitol said, you know what, we should probably repackage that Birth of the Cool stuff on LP and try to cash in on that cow. So again, the big label guys are very much money driven, which shouldn't come as no surprise. But it's interesting seeing each of these labels. Atlantic, for example. Atlantic was a small indie label in the 50s. Very much a rhythm and blues label, a jazz label. Their future in rock and roll and heavy metal and all the stuff they end up doing down the road is decades away. So they're very much a small entity during this moment in jazz. And Atlantic's very creative. When you look at 5960, by then, Atlantic's done more risky stuff than most of the other small labels combined. When you look at Ornette Coleman, when you look at John Coltrane, when you look at Charlie Mingus, those 3 guys alone at Atlantic are doing stuff that Blue Note, Prestige, Riverside, Contemporary, those labels wouldn't have touched a lot of that stuff. It was pretty cutting edge. So it's just an interesting analysis, I guess, is all it is. And interesting to hear some feedback from you guys on some of those thoughts. You know, you've seen it in hip hop, we've seen it in disco, we've seen it in new wave, we've seen it in grunge, and you can still see it going back to jazz. Innovation that labels grabbed onto, innovations they were scared to touch. And again, Columbia really gets a tip of the cap, because by 1960 they were certainly putting out as risky a jazz as most labels would offer this side of Coltrane's out stuff. You know, Columbia never really gets there. But when you try to think of groundbreaking, edgy, contemporary with what's happening in the jazz world around it, the list of records that are on those major 4 labels that you would say these are groundbreaking records at the time that this scene was happening, it's not a very long list. And I'm curious what you guys can think of that you feel like would qualify. You know, I mean, what's the great hard bop record on those labels that's in 56, 57 as hard bop's really coming to the fore? You know, Mercury, they have some great records with Clifford Brown, Max Roach at 54, 55, taking that chance with Emerson, and they're pushing out some really great stuff. So again, it's all kind of just analytical stuff, looking at the labels in the industry and how money drives things. But if you have examples of great records that are cutting edge jazz from the 50s and 60s on those big labels, give me your thoughts. And by the 60s, things start to really change. We're getting into a moment where the consciousness of the 60s, the white college scene, the consciousness, the thought, the communion of people. There's a kind of new awareness and an awakening in the hippie sub movement that connects with jazz from the 60s. And if you're a fan of psychedelic rock and Jimi Hendrix and the Grateful Dead and all that stuff that was happening in the 60s, the free jazz and spiritual jazz and avant-garde jazz of the mid-60s dovetails really nicely with those people who were from that rock camp. So anyway, I'm just going to leave it with that today. Contemporary, put that stuff out there. It's great. Give me a box set on the Blackhawk stuff. It needs to be done. You all be safe. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't. If you want to support the channel, go to Patreon in the link below, or you can go to the description and find my merchandise page. You can grab a t-shirt or a hoodie, help support the channel that way. It's always very much appreciated. Y'all be safe. Have a great day. Peace. One quick tidbit I want to add here. On my episode the other day, Contemporary Titles Craft Records needs a release for consumers. I chose a picture of Los Angeles, like it's Wilshire Boulevard, going towards Hollywood, as my background for my title page. And there just happens to be a billboard for craft foods that I did not see or notice on this piece of art, which is quite the coincidence in and of itself. Oddly enough, the billboard says craft true mayonnaise at its finest, which I think someone could take that as a slight to Craft Records. If that had been intentional, perhaps. Maybe I'm insulting what they're doing, calling it kind of pablum mainstream stuff for white America, true mayonnaise at its finest. But it was completely a coincidence. I had no idea it was there. It wasn't until after the episode was up and launched that I even noticed the craft sign and then what it said. I think it's an interesting, funny little tidbit. And go back and look at that title page if you're interested in seeing it. It's a strange coincidence, to say the least. Anyway, peace.